All right, good morning. We're going to continue in our bit of staff devotion, our look at the scripture here, especially in the life of Joseph. And we started last week, I started a conversation about some contrast between Joseph and his brother Judah. I actually had the opportunity over the weekend to preach at a church here locally. And it was a really good time. It was really rich. And we talked in that message, we got the chance to talk about the life of Judah as a sort of contrasting character, but as a featured character in the story of Joseph, or what we consider the story of Joseph. So here's what I'd like to do. I want to talk through some more of this element and some of the sort of features in how we read and pay attention to what's going on in biblical narrative, and what looking for some of these things might help us do as we, sorry, I lost my train of thought. What some of these features and some of these characters and some of this focus might help us do as we look at biblical story and we consider what the biblical stories are doing and are telling us and are communicating with us. So I want to highlight a couple of things from the life of Judah, and then I want to just sort of process through a sort of how we connect the dots, looking at the text of the Bible, because playing that connect the dots really helps us sort of round out a picture of what's going on as we look at these stories. So first thing, Judah and Joseph are contrasting characters in the storyline that begins in Genesis 37 and runs to the end of the book of Genesis. And so Judah and Joseph are, they're brothers or half-brothers, and they clearly they don't get along. Judah is the individual, I call him the prophet brother. He's the family member who decides that it's best, instead of killing Joseph, which, listen, that's a good thing. Let's not kill our brother. But he decides, hey, let's sell him because we can get something out of this. And so there's an angle here that Judah's working for himself. And Joseph is sort of I had a dream and I'm waiting for God to make that dream a reality. And I'm not sure how that's going to work or how that's going to look or what all that means. And he's sorting that out. He might be sorting that out in a way that sort of flaunts his favoritism with the rest of his brothers. We're not entirely sure. He might be just trying to sort that out as a young, naive, got to figure it out 17-year-old. Well, Judah asks the question, what does it profit us if we kill our brother and conceal his blood, in Genesis 37:26? And then in 27, he offers, let's sell him instead. And so they sell him for 20 shekels of silver. Immediately after Genesis 37, Joseph's been sold. He ends up in the house of Potiphar, the captain of the guard. The story shifts in 38, and we get the story of Judah and Tamar. After selling Joseph, Judah leaves his family and joins himself to an individual by the name of Hira, who's an Adulamite. And Judah gets married, and he has some sons, and then his sons, or his oldest son, gets married. His oldest son is wicked. The Lord puts him to death. And then Judah tells his second son to marry Tamar. His second son is wicked. The Lord puts him to death. And so then Judah withholds his third son from Tamar until the third son is old enough, and tells Tamar to live as a widow in her father's house. While that's happening, Judah sort of just relinquishes responsibility to ever give his third son to Tamar. And along the way, she decides that she needs to sort of rectify the situation. She figures out that Judah is on his way to Enaim, and so she comes and she takes off her widow's garments, she puts on other clothing, and she veils her face. Now, the description of the way Tamar is dressed is the exact same description in Genesis 38 as it was in Genesis 24 when Rebekah meets Isaac for the first time. She puts on a veil, and that's really the only description we get of the way Tamar is dressed. She's taken off her widow's garments, put on some different ones, and put a veil over. Judah takes her veiled appearance to be a prostitute instead of a bride. And he exploits the situation for his own advantage. He's exploited Joseph for his own advantage. Now he's exploited Tamar for his own advantage. Something is up with Judah, and it comes down to this word profit. In 37:26, Judah asks the question, what does it profit us? And the word for profit in the Hebrew there is the same word for plunder, or to gain by violence. So to plunder, to gain by violence, to profit from something, it's all the same Hebrew word. Judah has profited from the selling of Joseph. And now he's profited by sort of taking advantage of his daughter-in-law, even though he doesn't realize that it's her, while she's dressed as a bride, which is what she was supposed to be promised to Shelah, the third son of Judah, based on the Levirate marriage practices that Judah has been employing here. So she should be a bride to Shelah, and she's dressed like a bride, but when Judah sees her, he sees an opportunity to plunder, to take advantage, to gain by mistreating Tamar. So this is Judah. This is the character of Judah that we see. Judah, however, has a sort of change in chapter 44. In chapter 44, Judah finally seems to get it. And when he gets it, he offers his life in service to his brother Joseph in exchange for Benjamin's, so that Joseph's keeping a brother captive doesn't do any more harm or damage to Jacob, their father. And Judah has finally gotten it. Something has switched. And here is the point of this biblical character thing that we're looking at. Early in the story, Judah is consistently taking advantage of the people in his life, specifically his family members. And Joseph is faithful throughout the story. Joseph does the next right thing. His father asks for an account of his brothers and what they have been doing in the field, and he tells them he's honest. And it gets him in trouble with his brothers. But Joseph has done the right thing. Joseph does the right thing in interpreting the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, and he's sort of forgotten about. He does the right thing in interpreting Pharaoh's dreams the right way. By the way, in both instances, giving credit to God who gives the interpretation. He did the right thing in Potiphar's house. Ironically, he does the right thing in Potiphar's house by avoiding a woman who wants to take advantage of Joseph, while Judah has taken advantage of Tamar. And so Judah is sort of the opposite character to Joseph. But when it matters at the end of the storyline, Judah has a change and he switches. And all of a sudden now Judah's doing like Joseph has done throughout the storyline. We focus on Joseph in the story because the story spends a lot of time with Joseph, and it's not bad to focus on Joseph. But what we do by focusing on Joseph is we forget that Judah is a featured character as well. And we're shown this in a couple of different ways. We get specific speeches from Judah where Reuben has said something and his brothers sort of listen, but not really. And then Judah speaks up and says something remarkably alike, or says the exact same thing in a case later in the story with his father for sure. And they listen to Judah. Reuben says something, Judah says the same thing. Reuben is not listened to, at least not fully. And then Judah says the same thing, and everybody listens to what Judah has to say. He's a featured character in that way. Judah's a featured character because of this little insert we have in 38. And chapter 38 seems to be a weird aberration. It seems to just show up out of nowhere. What is going on? What is this chapter doing here in the story of Joseph? Because the story of Joseph is also the story of Judah. Here's one way to think of it. Joseph is a flat character in the storyline from 37 to 50. He does the right thing. He's faithful. Every single time. There's really no change in Joseph. He consistently does the right thing every time. Judah, on the other hand, is consistently sort of a jerk. He plunders his family. He takes advantage of Joseph by selling him. He robs his father of the favored son and gains, perhaps, or is at least seeking to gain, perhaps, favor from the father by getting rid of Joseph. He takes advantage of Tamar. This is Judah. He's not necessarily an upstanding citizen, but later in the story, there's a change. And Judah has now done the right thing. Instead of plundering his father of a brother, which he did with Joseph when he's faced with the opportunity with Benjamin, he offers himself in exchange for Benjamin, which is one of those biblical images of redemption. Take me instead of this other individual. Judah's change is highlighted because of Joseph's consistency. The flat character in Joseph becomes a foil. It becomes a contrast by which we see just how important the change is in the life of Judah. Biblical characters often operate this way. There are moments in the story where God as a character says something that seems to be harsh or critical. And God is evoking a response in a conversation with Abraham before Sodom and Gomorrah, in a conversation with Moses about wiping out the Israelites in the desert because of the golden calf incident. And this surprising element from the character of God in the story invites Moses and invites Abraham into a dialogue and into a conversation where their words serve as a contrast to what God had to say. And together, God and his human partner in leading his people say, okay, yeah, this is the righteous way to go about this. And in each case, I don't think God's being unrighteous or he's changing or I think he's looking for the right response out of his character. And in that moment, the way to do it is by saying something inflammatory. Judah and Joseph function a lot of the same way. Joseph sets up an inflammatory situation with his brother, and he's looking for his brothers who have been plundering their family to self-sacrifice, to give instead of plunder. And so he's put money back after they've paid for grain twice. And he's put his cup in the belongings of Benjamin. And now Judah is faced with a choice. I can let my brother take the heat, and I can let my brother be dragged into Egypt in slavery, a lot like Joseph. And it can cause my father pain and grief and heartache and sorrow. Or I can stand up and I can offer myself as a replacement. I can take this opportunity to do something different. But we notice that change in the life of Judah because of Joseph's consistency in being faithful. Joseph's consistency in doing the right thing makes it really stand out and pop when Judah does the right thing, because up until that moment, he's consistently done the selfish thing. Reading biblical characters requires two things. First, biblical characters require us to compare and contrast. We need to look at what happens between one character and another. Tamar says it of, or Judah says it of Tamar, that she has been more righteous than he has been as her situation gets resolved with his signet, his cord, and his staff, something we're going to have to talk about later in this little dialogue about Joseph and the storyline of Joseph and Judah. But biblical characters form these comparatives. There's a flat character, there's a righteous character, there's a rash, a foolish character, there's an unrighteous character. And we are to highlight the distinctions and the nuances as we read the stories. Doing that, however, requires two things. So we're looking at two pieces. Number one, we need to compare and contrast our characters in the biblical story. Who does it right? Why? Who does it wrong? Why? Is there change in those characters? What happens? Why does that change come about? Somebody like Judah is a prime example. The second thing that we need to pay attention to also has two parts to it. And that's first, we need a broader scope when we read our stories. So first, we need to consider that the stories of the scripture are an interconnected arc that starts in Genesis and goes all the way to Revelation. And that interconnected arc is composed of these little micro stories, and Genesis does this really well for us. We get a formula at the introduction of every new micro story in the big narrative arc with a genealogy. There's a genealogy from Abraham to Noah that introduces Noah's storyline. There's a genealogy from Noah to Abraham that introduces Abraham's storyline. One from Abraham to Isaac, and one from Isaac to Jacob, and one from Jacob to Joseph. Every story starts with this genealogy, and that genealogy is a transition. Hey, this story back here of Noah is connected to this story of Abraham because Abraham is a descendant of Noah, and we're following this line of people that God has had these special relationships with. Well, that means that when we look at some of these stories, we need to open up and broaden the context of the arc, because what tends to happen is we shift to the story of Joseph and then we lock in and we don't pay attention to these connected moments. So I talked about this story of Judah and Tamar, and why is it in the story of Joseph? It has huge significance for what's going on in the life of Joseph and Judah. On the other hand, it's also connected to a story from, I think it's Genesis 35, if I remember correctly. It might be 34, where one of the daughters of Jacob is taken advantage of by one of the locals, and he's a prince in one of the towns nearby. And the brothers, Jacob's sons, the brothers Simeon and Levi, are enraged that she's been treated like this, and that she's been taken. And before she's been betrothed and been formally somebody's bride, and this is not okay with them. They're enraged, and so they play a little trick on the people of the town, and they say, "Okay, so listen, if you all get circumcised, we'll let you marry our sister." And he says, "Okay, yeah, no problem." And so this guy goes ahead. Everybody in the town gets circumcised, and then they take advantage of that situation. While everybody's a bit uncomfortable and not prepared, then the brothers launch an attack, and they kill everybody in the town. And Jacob chastises his sons for this. He says, what are you doing? You're going to make this so difficult for me to get along with the people who live here by doing things like this. And their response is this: should he treat our sister like a prostitute? This individual wanted this sister as a bride. But the brothers see her treatment as one like a prostitute. Genesis 38. Tamar's dressed like a bride, and Judah's treated her like a prostitute. It's a connected idea here. We need to broaden our look at what happens in the lives of these characters. Second thing, we need to broaden our look at the way that the story flows. We lock into chapter and this vignette in the life of Joseph, and we stay there, where the ability to see the arc that includes Judah in the storyline of Joseph, as we typically understand it, means being able to hold in mind what we saw in Genesis. Being able to hold in mind what we saw in Genesis 37, while the story develops with Joseph, and keeping in mind the character that Judah was in 37 and in 38, when we see him again in 43 and in 44. I think our tendency of reading in smaller chunks, chapter at a time, and in reading, looking at the text, not necessarily aloud, not necessarily hearing it, locks us into these narrower looks at Scripture. So there's two things. We need to consider broader story arcs. The story of Joseph really begins with the story of Jacob. And Judah, as a character in the story of Joseph's life, really kind of functions like Jacob did with Esau and some of these others. And so we need to broaden our look at how these stories connect and flow together. Second, we need to broaden our look at characters in their comparison and their contrast as they interact with one another across little micro stories and vignettes. This is one of those ways we read narrative, and we look and we ask questions of, why does the narrator bother to tell us the Judah and Tamar story? And why does it matter? Because biblical characters matter to us, and biblical characters that form comparisons and contrasts really matter to us because they highlight different things in the life of the story that's bigger than just those characters. Okay, hopefully this is helpful for us, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Wednesday. We'll talk soon.